Let's get going. George Bizos has been hailed as a towering legal mind who remained committed to the fight for justice until his last days. The 92-year-old passed away last night and has been praised by South Africans for his contribution to the fight against the racist apartheid regime and championing the cause of many other people who had their rights violated over the decades. Among his high-profile legal battles was the Rivonia trial representing the late Nelson Mandela. He later took on some of the fight for justice during the inquiry into the Marikana massacre. Someone who knew him and worked quite closely with Bizos over the decades is Advocate Dali Mpofu, who joins me now in studio to talk more about the life and times of George Bizos. Advocate Mpofu, a very good afternoon to you. Thank you for coming in. We're keeping our social distance. I want to go back to your first meeting, your first engagement with George Bizos. Do you still remember that?
Yes, I do, particularly because by that time, obviously, he was somebody that we all revered, over the distance, particularly his work on the Biko inquest and various other, the Neil Agate issues. But the first time I ever met him, I was still a student at WITS. And he came, I think, to give some talk with other great lawyers. But obviously, as young students, we were all literally just hovering around him. I met him a couple of times like that when I was a law student. But of course, the first time that I worked with him was while I was a student. I also had to do some work, to raise money. And I was lucky enough to work for Kathy Satchwell, who later became a judge. And she was one of the instructing attorneys in the Delmas trial, the famous Delmas trial, where Tera Likota, Popo Mulife, Malindi, and people like that were charged. And that, I can assure you, I probably, at that stage, I thought, okay, well, I can retire now. Because I had an opportunity to be traveling. I used to catch a lift with him all the way to Delmas, which is about an hour or so away. And I can tell you the stories that he used to share in the car, the food, these discussions about vegetable gardens and so on. So I got to know a bit of the man, behind the legend. Then, of course, and that trial went on for quite a long time. Then, of course, I had another opportunity to work with him in the 90s on the trial of Mrs. Mandela and those kinds of activities around the early 90s. And then we had other encounters. I became a member of the Johannesburg Bar and, to be kind of a colleague of George Bizos's. And a funny story is that when I was appointed as a senior counsel, so I tried to explain to my mother that, I'm now a senior counsel. And she was not interested. She didn't know what that means. Until I said, yeah, see, I'm at the same level as George Bizos. So I said, oh, really? Well, congratulations. Because once you mentioned George Bizos, it meant something to our people from all walks of life.
But I want to stay, sorry, Advocate, I want to stay with Wits for a moment because you were among a young group of law students who were fascinated with this Greek immigrant lawyer who was involved, yes, in the struggle, but it was a time of great racial and racist tension in the country. I'm wondering, just in terms of rationalizing and making sense of his involvement in the struggle, how you as black students understood that, granted that decades earlier he'd already been involved in cases such as the Rivonia trial.
Yes, George Bizos was one of those people who literally transcended color. I mean, we revered him. I think he probably got the status of Joe Slovo, because so many people who knew George Bizos by name or someone like Joe Slovo actually did not think that they were white people, because, people who, I still remember in East London where I grew up, there's a gentleman there who is as chubby as George, and his name is Bizos. The whole, and I'm sure most people just call him Bizos. They don't even know where the name came from. Then, of course, we were very fascinated by the fact that, and I'm glad you mentioned the racial element, because, it's easy now in 2020 to everyone praises George Bizos, but to think that people like him in the white community were very isolated, hated, subjects of all sorts of vitriol from the regime in those days. And their lives were literally in danger at all times because they were seen as basically, the stumbling block in the project of apartheid. And there are many people like that, Charles Carlson, Dennis Cooney, SC, and people like that who really stuck out in the days of the death sentence when combatants of Umkhonto weSizwe were captured. We knew that we could rely on people like that. So that's a very important angle. And then, of course, I had probably the best time with George when we worked together in the Marikana Commission. It was a fascinating thing because he was already old at that stage. And if you remember that commission for about a year actually was sitting in Rustenburg. But George, would travel the distance because he was so passionate about his work. And we would tell him, no, George, you don't have to come every day. You must come only when you have to do a witness. But he would be there, and do his work like everyone else and never expected any special favors because he was George Bizos. He treated us like his colleagues. We knew that we would never be, at his level, but he treated us as his equals, which was a mark of the man, the humility of the man.
And when the Marikana inquiry was sitting, George Bizos, as you say, was already quite elderly. He was in his 80s. But what captured a lot of people, especially, I can say, from my generation, who weren't familiar with some of his earlier work, was that even at that ripe old age, he was incredibly sharp and meticulous in just going through some of the finer detail of the evidence. And I would imagine that that has now influenced younger people such as yourself.
Absolutely. He was extremely sharp. In a way, we called ourselves sweepers because the witnesses, of course, they were so scared of George Bizos. So, when they were being cross-examined by him, they'll be all up in their guards. Then when our turn comes, they think, oh, well, at least the tough part is over. And so we would be able to take advantage and dovetail with him, yeah. But we learned a lot. And, one day one will tell the stories of exactly how he contributed, even indirectly, to some of the work we're doing, training young people and just fascinating people for being next to him, basically. And he was a very, very kind human being. Yeah.
He said, he was quoted saying that he was never at any point tempted to go into politicians. Do you think he would have made a good politician?
No. I don't think he would have made a good politician because, the rough and tumble of politics is not for people like George. George was a very technical lawyer in a way. One of my memories of him, something I will never forget, is the fact that when he cross-examined somebody, he was so proud of what he was doing that he would literally look at the gallery for approval when he delivers the fatal blow. So he was a lawyer, an advocate, a senior counsel, and a lawyer's lawyer. And he knew everyone by their first names, and he took time. You can imagine all sorts of people, even in this old age, wanted to take photos with him, and he had time for them, and he would tell his fascinating stories.
And he felt things quite deeply, didn't he? Because in the last, decade or so, George Bizos, like many other of his people of his generation, would speak about the problems in the country, but he was possibly the only one who would at times break down and sob and weep, essentially, because of just how deeply he was feeling what was going on.
Yes, well, you can imagine someone who was involved in the struggle directly and indirectly from the 50s, having seen all the trials and tribulations, having, probably was the most frequent visitor to Robben Island. So he knew, where we come from. So to see some of the mess that is engulfing the country now, literally, as you say, drove him to tears, and rightfully so, because for him, he was not interested in money, he was not interested in politics or positions, as you say. He was simply interested in justice and equality. So everything he did, he literally, I don't even think he ever pictured himself sitting in parliament or doing anything like that. If he wanted to go to parliament, I have no doubt that he would have been high on any list of any organization that wanted to take him there. But this is someone who was doing it for its own sake, for the sake of equality, without expecting any self-gain. And so he was rightfully appalled by the current situation.
Advocate Dali Mpofu, good to speak to you, sir. Thank you. Advocate Dali Mpofu, among the many South Africans this afternoon reflecting on the passing and indeed the life of the late George Bizos.